Well, welcome back. So, I know a lot of people will be excited about this series. We are kicking it off. Yes, we are going to cover a series that has been highly requested by so many people. We are going to be showing you how to, from start to finish, build a trading robot using Python. And more specifically, we're going to be showing it using the TD Ameritrade API. So yes, this, again, just putting that out there right now, this will be assuming that you have a TD Ameritrade account. That is not to say down the road I will not do interactive brokers or the other ones, but right now, this one will be covering purely TD Ameritrade. So this wonderful series, it's been a few months in the making. So there's a lot of stuff that kind of comes along with this. I will say that. Additionally, I do want to spend a few minutes just going over it, right? So I don't want to jump right into the coding. I really want to take some time. Let's talk about what are we trying to do and how are we trying to do it. For those of you who, I know there's a lot of people out there, they kind of just want to use the library. They don't want to necessarily kind of care about what's going on behind the scenes. That is okay to a certain extent, but I will say this, you really should know kind of what's going on behind the scenes. The only reason I say that is, there's a lot of things that are being calculated, and it's a little bit easier to understand how to use it if you kind of understand how it was built. So even though things will probably change a little bit from what you're going to be seeing now, I mean, well, it's going to change a lot, but I think having that idea of like, hey, how did we structure the code? How do we think about the different objects and how do they kind of all interact together? Yeah, you might not necessarily go out there and rewrite the library, but it's a good idea to kind of just understand why was it built this way and kind of how is everything talking to each other. Additionally, I will say this as well. It is assumed that if you're watching this series, that you're coming in with, a relatively decent understanding of Python and some level of familiarity with certain popular libraries like Pandas or NumPy, something like that. If you're very new to programming, I'm actually going to say hold off on this series for a little bit. You might want to go get familiar with certain concepts. Like you should be comfortable with, class objects. You should be very comfortable with if statements, for loops, anything like that. I know sometimes we kind of just want to jump into it, but the thing is, this can actually make real trades for you. And if you don't understand how it's working, and if you don't know how to structure the code, you're going to be making real trades with real money. So with that being said, I am saying if you're not comfortable with programming in that regard, you need to get familiar with it and then kind of come back to this series. I do have some videos that cover different topics, but there are also plenty of other channels out there who have a ton of content that will more than likely get you right up to speed. So with that being said, let's get started. All right, first things first. This is actually a really complex topic. Trading's already hard enough, right? Like a lot of people who day trade, who don't even really day trade, I mean, just trade in general, you'll learn right away that it's not easy, right? I mean, there's a lot of things you have to understand. There's all these fancy terms, there's all these technical indicators out there, and there's all this kind of background knowledge that you have to understand in order to trade effectively. So you've got to understand order types, you've got to understand indicators, you've got to understand, different things related to account activity. So we've already taken a pretty complex topic, and now we've made it even more complex by adding this whole wonderful world of programming into it. So that just makes it a little bit more challenging. Doesn't make it impossible. It doesn't even make it where it can't be done. It just means we need to be very focused when we go about this whole process. And part of being focused means we really need to start at a high level by defining our objectives. What I have found is a lot of times people will reach out and say, hey, I'm trying to build a trading robot, and I've kind of picked their brain a little bit. And I say, okay, well, what are you trying to do? Like, how are you trying to do it? And something that kind of became very apparent to me relatively quickly was people were trading, but they also weren't understanding how they were trading in very explicit terms, because behind the scenes, they were making all these assumptions, right? And certain things like, when they would make an order, for a lot of people, maybe, for example, a big assumption was it's just a market order. Well, now all of a sudden you're going to have to ask, I'm going to have to ask you that, right? You're going to have to tell me what type of order you want to place. So all of a sudden, I'm going to start requiring you to be very explicit with how you trade, because you don't get that luxury anymore. You have to be able to tell that robot, hey, you need to trade like this. And if you want it to truly mimic your trading, you have to give it all that information, and you have to tell it up front and say, hey, you got to be this order. You've got to be using this price. You've got to be, buying this amount of quantity. So all of the sudden, this is where people tend to struggle a little bit, because now I'm forcing them to really be extremely explicit about how they're trading. So a lot of times what I have found is having people take a step back and really sit down and write. Write it out. There's something wrong with writing out, but write out, how do you trade? It's not just sitting there, well, I just placed an order. It's more than that. And that. It's, there's a type of order, there's a quantity, there's all these little finer details that are going into it. And you now need to start identifying those finer details. So that's usually where, again, at least from my experience, this is where people kind of struggle a little bit, because I'm forcing them to be very explicit, and it's very easy to get overwhelmed. So naturally, what I do is I kind of take a step back and say, okay, well, you don't have to answer every question, but ideally, you want to have a general idea about the big questions, right? The same kind of relates here when we're talking about the objective, right? We're not going to have to necessarily define every little fine detail yet, but we should generally have a decent understanding about what are the big things that this trading robot needs to do. Now, this is not an exhaustive list. This doesn't contain every possible thing it needs to do. But when I was kind of approaching this, I kind of asked myself, what is really the things that this thing needs to do, right? So what are the objectives of this trading robot, and what does it have to do in order to function the way I think it should function? Well, probably the biggest thing is it needs to stream quotes, right? So it needs to be able to get price information from somewhere, because that price information is used in so many different parts. It's used when we're calculating indicators. It's used when we're placing orders. It's used when we're trying to organize our data. So one of the first things we have to have built into this is we've got to have some type of mechanism for getting price information. Once we have that price information, we can manipulate it and do whatever we want with it. But we have to have some type of mechanism for getting that information. Now, right now, the way I've built the library is I am using not this TD streaming API, I am using the TD standard API. So it's not to say the streaming API won't come in at some point, but right now, just to kind of keep things a little bit more simple, I'm relying purely on the standard API. And I will show you there's ways we can kind of mimic, that's a loose word, but we'll stick with it, mimic the streaming API in certain regards. So the big first thing we need to have is price information. So we're gonna have to basically have a robot somehow get price. Additionally, we need some type of functionality where we can enter and exit positions, right? That's trading. You're gonna enter a position because you got a buy signal maybe, and then maybe you're gonna have to exit a position because you got a sell, a sell signal, right? So we have to have some type of functionality. This robot's gotta be able to, hey, take a signal and then act on that signal. And the way it acts is it determines, well, maybe I need to create a new order that will then reverse the position I just created, right? So we have to have some type of functionality like that. Additionally, we need to have some type of functionality where it goes and it can help us manage our account data, right? And so we have a lot of account data out there, and very often we will find that that account data is critical when it comes to making trades. For example, I have some individuals who will say, once I own a position, I do not want to enter another position for that same ticker symbol. So we now have to build in some logic that says, hey, the minute that person enters a position, even if I get a buy signal, do not enter a new position. So this is all of the sudden where being explicit is very important, because sometimes people don't realize that. Some people won't trade like that. And some people say, I don't care if there's another buy signal, maybe just add to the position. Not saying it's right or wrong, but I'm saying is you have to define that role beforehand. So Because of that, and because sometimes the logic that we build depends on what we already have in our account activity, we need to have some type of mechanism for getting that account activity and organizing it in a fashion where we can then use it in other decision-making processes of our robot. And probably the big one is we need to have a mechanism for calculating technical indicators. A lot of individuals use technical indicators in order to trade. They use it to determine when to enter or exit a position. They use it to determine when the market is behaving more in a more active manner compared to a more, I don't want to say sedative. Is that what a sedative mean? I don't know. Regardless, they use it in order to make decisions. Sometimes it's determined when to start looking for signals. Other times it's used to determine when to enter or exit a position. So we have to have some type of mechanism for helping us calculate those indicators. So with that, we have an objective. This is ideally at a very high level. This is what we want our robot to do. When we think about our solution, we now have to kind of start going into our programming world, right? Well, a lot of times we're thinking of very object-oriented programming. So with that being said, we need to start thinking about our objects. What are the objects that we're going to be creating? And what are they going to be doing for us? Like, how does it fit into the bigger picture of our robot? Well, the first thing that we're going to have to do is we're going to have to mimic, guess what? You, right? So we have to mimic you as an individual. The way we mimic you is we define our robot object. Our robot object is mimicking how you interact with your TD Ameritrade account. But what this robot's going to do is it's going to interact with the TD Ameritrade API. So the robot is really designed to mimic you. And the way it's going to be mimicking you is it's going to be making requests to the TD Ameritrade API, right? So it's going to be getting quotes. It's going to be placing orders. It's going to be getting account activity. So this robot is going to be handling all the talking to the TD Ameritrade API. And so the way I also like to think about this is the highest level of our kind of hierarchy. If we think about our objects as a hierarchy, we can't do anything unless we have a robot. So we can't do any trading unless we have you in the picture. So even though you're not necessarily there physically manipulating the robot is designed to mimic you. So it's like we're copying you, we're putting you into a program, and we're saying, hey, this robot has to be the main point of entry. If I don't have a robot, I can't do anything else. So that's our first object. Our second object, we're going to be working with a ton of price data, and we are going to need to organize that price data in a very consistent manner. And we're going to have easy mechanisms for adding data, appending data. Well, I guess adding and appending are the same thing. Maybe in some cases, deleting data, selecting data, and just keeping all of our information organized in a very easy fashion. So we're going to create a object, which we're going to call a stock frame. Now, maybe stock frame isn't the best name, and I've actually debated if that's even remotely correct, but for right now, we're going to keep it like that. The stock frame at the end of the day is going to be just a pandas data frame, but I don't want to make it too general, right? I don't want to necessarily say, oh, well, yeah, it's a pandas data frame, so why are you doing all this extra fluff? And I debated about that. I mean, initially I said, am I just doing overkill right now? Like, is it really necessary to just define a new object that really is just a pandas data frame? And I found, yeah, it kind of is sometimes. And the only reason why is our data is going to be very finance oriented, right? And there's a lot of finance operations that you can do in pandas that would just be nice or a little bit easier to do if it was set up correctly, right? So things like, maybe it makes sense to have a multi-index data frame instead of just a normal data frame where, the index is all right there. So that might necessarily be beneficial. Additionally, there are some mechanisms where adding data to a data frame could be a little bit challenging sometimes, depending on, how it's organized. And so I wanted to kind of take away the hassle of managing that and just say, you know what? as long as we're interacting with the API consistently, all I really care about is doing common operations. So maybe that's adding new rows, right? And then once I've added new rows, there might be certain other things I might want to do, right? So for example, if I have indicators in my stock data frame, I might want to refresh those indicators, or in other words, recalculate them with the new data in mind. And so what we'll find is that stock frame is going to make that process very easy for us, very, very easy for us. So you don't have to worry about that now. You're just going to call a method, and guess what? It's going to do a lot of magic behind the scenes, but that's what it's intended to do. It's supposed to make it easier to work with. So the stock frame is going to really be helping us to organize our data. Additionally, we're going to now have our next object, which is a portfolio. Our portfolio is designed to kind of mimic our account activity. Maybe that's the orders that we already have active, right? Or maybe that's the positions that we have currently in our account that are have been filled, right? So the portfolio is really designed to mimic our account activity, because a lot of times we'll be making decisions based on data that comes from our account, right? So say, for example, I don't want to enter a position if I already have that stock already in my portfolio. Well, this way, by having a portfolio object, we can easily ask those questions and then transfer that information to our decision-making process. So with our portfolio object, it will be very useful when it comes to organizing that information and asking questions as we're trading. That's really how I think about it, is that asking questions component. Do I have that stock? Well, let me just go check my portfolio. And then if I do, well, great. I'll just go trade. If I don't, okay, well, no, I won't trade. So that's really important. Additionally, there's sometimes where our trading can really depend on certain metrics about our portfolio, right? So for example, maybe I don't want more than 60% of my portfolio in equity, right? So it would be nice if we had some type of pre-built functionality where we could easily calculate those metrics on the fly. And so ideally with this portfolio object, we would be able to answer those questions and then calculate those metrics as we need. And then additionally, as we might need to do more advanced operations, we can now easily add that functionality, but keep it contained to where it belongs. And that really is that portfolio aspect. So that's the portfolio object. Next object, trading, right? So we're gonna be doing a lot of trading. So we need to define a trade object, right? So our trade is really our order, but we also understand that an order can be relatively complex depending on how you're trading. It might not just be a market order. It could be it could be an OCO order. It could be a child order incorporated into it. So all of a sudden, we have to have some type of structure where we can easily modify our orders, or we can easily add components to it in an easy fashion. And this is normally where people struggle a lot, because unfortunately, the TD Ameritrade API was really lacking when it came to the examples of how to place orders and how to do that. And so over the many months of using this API, I've kind of figured out, okay, well, this is how you do that. And I wanted to kind of have that functionality pre-built for you. So that way, if you want to add things like a stop loss or a stop loss and a take profit, just an order you already placed, well, you can just call a method and it will do all that for you behind the scenes, instead of you having to take these very nested dictionaries that can get very messy very quickly, and instead use that trade object to do it. And then additionally, what I would like to do is I'd like to see that trade object help us answer questions like, has it been filled yet? Was it partially filled? So ideally, I'd like this trade object to help us answer even more complex questions that might come down the road. That functionality might not be there right now, but I could definitely envision that object actually containing it. So that's why I thought it was important to help encapsulate all that into that kind of just that single object, because it's very important. And it really is kind of, I would say, the meat of our kind of real-time activity. We want to be able to ask those questions on the fly. And so that trade object will help us do that. Final object, indicators. Yay. Indicators. We've already said this multiple times. A lot of people use technical indicators in order to make trades. Now, right now, we are purely doing it from a technical analysis standpoint. That is not to say that down the road we might not include fundamental analysis, but right now it is purely technical analysis. And so this indicator object is going to help us calculate and define those indicators for us in an easy, consistent fashion. I think the biggest thing here is the consistent fashion. It's very easy to get overwhelmed when it comes to calculating indicators, and it's very easy to find yourself in a position where all of a sudden you're working with this pandas data frame and it gets really hard to do it because, well, was it grouped? Was it not grouped? Was it organized? Was it not organized? And all of a sudden you will start pulling your hair out just like I did, because all of a sudden it's not straightforward. And that was like the thing that drove me crazy. So what I found was, let's define an indicator object where we can easily calculate those indicators. And as long as I know what you're passing me through, hint, hint, it's the stock frame. But as long as I know what you're passing through, I can easily calculate all those indicators for you. In fact, initially, what I was actually going to do is I was going to use a few libraries to calculate those indicators, because I thought, man, this is great. That's going to be super easy. No problem whatsoever. And then what I found out was it was always assumed that you were given a very standard data frame. And I said, well, that's assuming the columns are named the same. That's assumed that this is named the same and all this other stuff, and that it's organized. And then they're assuming that when it's going in there that it's sorted. And when I say, well, what if it's not sorted? Are they going to sort that for you? And so all of a sudden I found, man, this could actually be a little bit challenging, because I'm going to have to do that on my end, because I don't know if they're necessarily doing that on their end. And so it's not to say maybe down the road I can't integrate those libraries, but right now I had to actually define some of these indicators myself, because I was finding that they were assuming certain things when it was being put in there. And so, for example, I think the biggest thing was, how do you calculate it if you have multiple multiple ticker symbols in the same data frame? A lot of those libraries can't handle that. And so all of a sudden I said, man, if I pass through groups, it's not going to work. I said, I'm going to have to filter or do X, Y, Z. And I said, man, this could get challenging really quickly. And so the indicator client object was really designed to kind of help make that interaction consistent, but still give you the flexibility where you can have all your data in a single data frame. Additionally, a lot of indicators can be calculated using different methodologies. I want that flexibility for the user. So I want the user to be able to say, hey, I want to calculate the RSI using this methodology. Great. Just tell me you want to do that. And then once I have that information, I can calculate that for you. So that was really the intent of the indicator object, was make it consistent and make it ideally easier to calculate those indicators real time. And then probably the biggest thing was having that stock frame and those indicator objects talk to each other. So as the stock frame was adding new data, the indicators would recalculate. That is very challenging to do sometimes in pandas. And honestly, that was one of the things that I think always surprised me about pandas. And maybe it could just be the fact of maybe I'm seeing the answer right in front of me and I'm just not seeing it, but something where it's like, I'm just adding rows. Like, how are these calculated columns not updating? And so I basically created what I'm calling is a refresh method. And basically what I've done is, when you call your indicator client, I've saved all the arguments you've passed through. So things like the period that you used, the methodology that you specified, and I saved that in the indicator client itself. And so what you'll find is, when I call the refresh method, I'm literally calculating those indicators again, but I'm using the saved information you sent me when you initially initialized those indicators. So it's pretty neat. Honestly, I thought that was kind of, I said, oh, this is maybe where Python really shines a little bit, but I thought that was kind of cool. So at a high level, this is how we're going to start thinking about building our solution. So with that being said, though, that actually finishes our presentation. Only 3 slides, but of course I was rambling. Oh, there's that too. So for those of you who are interested in it, the library is currently posted on GitHub, so you are more than welcome to clone it. It is not on PyPy, so you cannot install it, at least not yet. It does have a few dependencies, so pandas, NumPy, and TD Ameritrade. The big one is pandas. I'm pretty sure once you install pandas, you don't technically need this, but I'm just leaving that there just to be safe. But really, if you want to kind of just high level, like, what does it look like? Well, first thing is you want to go to my GitHub account, so averead1192. Then you can see this wonderful photo, which is horrible. And then you will see some repos that I currently have available. And one of them is called the Python Trading Robot. And so this is the one that I will be recreating in this series. Again, just to be very upfront, lots of changes coming, so this will change a lot. So don't be surprised if you go in here every so often, you're like, wait, he changed it again. Oh yeah, lots coming. And then from here, if you want, you can always clone it. So if you just go over here to the green little button, clone or download, and then if you copy it, you can just do it like so. I've covered that in other videos, so I will put a link to one where I've showed how to clone a repo, but again, hopefully pretty straightforward. There's some unit testing kind of built in. I'm adding to it, but right now there's some stuff in there. Most of it is for the main robot itself. So just, again, asking some general questions. And then there's some indicators, portfolios, and, stuff like that. And then documents, well, unfortunately nothing right now, but at least a template. And then you can actually see the main robot file. So if you were running it, this stuff, again, I do have a config file. I get this asked a lot. You don't have to do this part. You don't have to, but you need to have your client ID, and you need to have your redirect URI, and you need to have your credentials path. You have to provide that information for you. How you choose to provide it is totally up to you. You can hard code it in your script. I don't recommend that. If you're sharing it with other people, you really should keep it secure, but you can. So I have a config file, so I write it every time I create a new library, and then I just import it as I need it. And then you'll see here, I create a robot, and then I do things like add positions, just ask certain questions and stuff like that. So ideally, this should be a little bit easy to hopefully follow. I would hope, but sometimes not. And then again, you can go through here. I've been trying to document everything, so I've been trying to add doc strings. And then I'm going to try to use like usage cases as well. So I'm trying to make sure that's all organized. If I've missed one, you're more than welcome if you want to just either bring it up or just do a pull request and then just add it for me. But yeah, so I mean, there's lots of good stuff here. Hopefully, again, I'm trying to be as clear as possible about how to use it. So hopefully it's hopefully straightforward. That's the goal at least. But I'll be probably, again, just making lots of changes. So again, please don't be surprised if you come here one and you're like, geez, he just changed like 5 files. But yeah, so I mean, you can obviously clone it. By all means, if you have suggestions, very open to it. People have been contributing to the Interactive Brokers one, the TD Ameritrade one. So again, people have been great with that. And so I'm always open to hearing that. Might not get back right away, but always open to hearing some suggestions. Other than that, I will say, I think that's going to be it for this particular video. Next video, I will be writing everything from scratch. So I will not be cloning it. We will just be basically recreating what we're seeing here, minus the setup and a lot of this other fancy stuff. But for the most part, we will be creating everything that we're kind of seeing right here. So that's what's going to be coming up in the next video. You got any questions at this point, by all means, ask away. Hopefully I have an answer. If I don't, I'm sorry. But yeah, that's pretty much it. So hopefully everyone's happy now. Yay, we're doing a trading robot. Woo! That's the exciting part, right? And then hopefully it's profitable, right? We'll see. But yeah, all right, we'll see you in the next video.